In the autumn of 2022, a team of geneticists at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig sat staring at a spreadsheet of numbers pulled from 13 sets of fragmented bones and teeth recovered from a limestone cave in the Altai mountains of southern Siberia. And what those numbers showed made several of them stop and read the data again, because it did not look like an error. It looked like a warning sign buried 54,000 years in the past, a signal that something had gone quietly and catastrophically wrong. Inside, the social fabric of an entire species long before that species vanished from the earth. The cave was called Chagyrskaya. The bones inside it belonged to Neanderthals, and the story hidden in their genetic code was about to force scientists to ask a question they had spent more than a century avoiding. Not what happened to Neanderthals in general, but what happened specifically to Neanderthal women, and whether the answer to that question was the real reason an entire species of humans disappeared from the planet. For roughly 300,000 years, Neanderthals dominated Ice Age Europe and large stretches of Western Asia. They hunted massive animals at close range, using thrusting spears against bison and other megafauna in a way that demanded raw courage and physical power. They buried their dead with apparent ceremony. They adorned themselves with feathers and eagle talons. They carved abstract symbols into cave walls in places like Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, long before modern humans arrived on the continent. They were not the shuffling, low-browed brutes of 19th century illustrations. They were an intelligent, adaptable, resilient species that outlasted multiple ice ages. And then, within what geologists consider an evolutionary blink of an eye, they were gone. For decades, the disappearance of the Neanderthals was explained with dramatic, almost cinematic narratives. Violent conflict with invading modern humans. A plague modern humans carried with them out of Africa. Simple competitive replacement, one species out-competing another for the same shrinking resources. These explanations were satisfying because they were simple. They gave extinction a villain and a clear moment of failure. The genetic evidence coming out of sites like Chagyrskaya Cave suggests something far quieter, far slower, and in many ways far more disturbing, because it points not to an external enemy, but to an internal fracture, one built into the very way Neanderthal society organized its women. For a long time, researchers assumed Neanderthal gender roles mirrored a comfortable, familiar template, the same template early anthropologists projected onto prehistoric humans generally. Men hunted. Women gathered plants, tended fires, cared for children, and stayed close to the relative safety of camp. It was a tidy division of labor that fit 19th and 20th century assumptions about how ancient societies must have worked. It was also, according to the physical evidence itself, almost certainly wrong. Skeletal remains identified as female Neanderthals do not show the build of a population that stayed home while males took on danger. They show dense cortical bone, heavily developed muscle attachment sites, and skeletal architecture built for extreme physical exertion, comparable, in some studies, to the bone density and muscle markings found in modern elite male athletes. These were not people whose bodies were shaped by gathering berries. Their bodies were shaped by violence, by exertion, by proximity to danger on a near constant basis. The injury patterns make the picture even sharper. Healed fractures on Neanderthal skeletons identified as female cluster, overwhelmingly around the head, neck, shoulders, and upper body, precisely the pattern seen in modern populations who work in close, repeated contact with large, unpredictable animals. Researchers have specifically compared this injury distribution to that of professional rodeo athletes, people whose job is to get physically close to creatures that can kill them in an instant. That comparison is not a poetic flourish. It is a clinical, evidence-based parallel drawn directly from trauma pattern analysis. Neanderthal women were not standing at a safe distance while the hunting happened. The physical record says they were in it, close to the animals, close to the risk, sustaining and healing from injuries that came from that proximity again and again over a lifetime. This alone forces a reconsideration of everything the traditional picture of Neanderthal society assumed, but bones can only describe bodies. They cannot describe relationships, movement between communities, or the deeper architecture of how Neanderthal groups were actually structured. For that, scientists needed something bones could never provide on their own. They needed DNA, and specifically, they needed enough of it, from enough individuals living at the same time, to reconstruct an actual community, rather than a scattered collection of isolated fossils, separated by tens of thousands of years. That is exactly what Chagyrskaya Cave provided, and it is why the site has become one of the most important locations in the entire field of paleogenetics. The cave sits in the Altai mountains of Russia, roughly 100 kilometers from the more famous Denisova Cave, the site that gave science its first evidence of the Denisovans, a separate ancient human lineage. Excavations at Chagyrskaya have been underway for years, uncovering not just Neanderthal remains, but a substantial collection of Middle Paleolithic stone tools, associated with the population that lived and worked there between roughly 50,000 and 59,000 years ago. In 2020, researchers first sequenced a high-coverage genome from a single bone found at the site, a finger bone cataloged as Chagyrskaya 8, and confirmed it belonged to a female Neanderthal who had lived there tens of thousands of years earlier. That single genome already hinted that Siberian Neanderthals lived in small, genetically isolated populations, likely fewer than 60 breeding individuals. But it was only a preview of what was coming. By 2022, the same research effort had expanded dramatically. Scientists recovered genetic material, much of it degraded, but enough of it exceptionally well preserved, from 13 individual Neanderthals across 2 nearby sites, 11 from Chagyrskaya Cave itself and 2 from the neighboring Okladnikov Cave. This made it, at the time, one of the largest genetic datasets ever assembled for a single Neanderthal population. What made the discovery genuinely historic was not simply the number of individuals, it was the realization that many of these individuals had not accumulated in the cave across scattered millennia, the way fossil remains typically do at most archaeological sites. Analysis suggested they had lived within an overlapping window of time, possibly within a single generation or two, meaning scientists were not looking at fragments scraped together from across 100,000 years of unrelated history. They were looking at something that resembled an actual social group, a community, people who may have known each other, hunted together, argued, cared for each other's children, and died within the same cave system. Among them, researchers identified a father and his teenage daughter along with a pair of second-degree relatives, evidence of direct family ties preserved in 54,000-year-old bone and tooth fragments. It was, in the words of one of the study's lead authors, close to meeting the first known Neanderthal family. The findings were published in Nature in October 2022, produced by a large international team, and were almost immediately recognized as one of the most significant contributions to Neanderthal research in a generation. But the true disturbance in the data was not the family ties. It was what showed up when researchers examined the genetic diversity of the group as a whole. Genetic diversity is not a minor academic detail. It is the biological insurance policy every population relies on to survive disease, adapt to changing environments, and avoid the compounding generation-over-generation damage of inbreeding. Even small, geographically isolated human populations, studied by anthropologists today, tend to retain a baseline level of genetic variation, a reflection of thousands of years of at least occasional contact, migration, and mixing with neighboring groups. The Chagyrskaya Neanderthals had almost none of it. Roughly 1/3 of the genomes recovered from the site carried unusually long stretches of homozygosity, meaning identical gene copies inherited from both parents, a hallmark signature of a population reproducing within an extremely restricted gene pool. Earlier analysis of the single 2020 genome had already found that nearly 13% of that individual's genome consisted of these long homozygous segments, a proportion consistent with a breeding population of well under 60 individuals. When the fuller 2022 dataset was analyzed, some estimates of the effective breeding population at Chagyrskaya dropped even lower, into a range of roughly 10 to 20 reproducing individuals contributing to the gene pool across generations. For a species capable of ranging across hundreds of kilometers of open landscape, a number that's small represents something close to genetic isolation at its most extreme edge. It was, by the standards of population genetics, operating near the very threshold of long-term viability. This raised an immediate and uncomfortable question. If the breeding population was really this small, how had these communities avoided total genetic collapse across countless generations? Where was new genetic material coming from, and why wasn't the population showing the compounding signs of severe, sustained inbreeding that should have accumulated over such a long span of isolation? The answer was hiding in the data, but only became visible once researchers stopped analyzing the genome as a single unified whole and instead separated the maternal and paternal genetic lineages and studied them independently. That decision changed everything. Geneticists have 2 powerful tools for tracing ancestry through a single parental line. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively from mother to child, generation after generation, essentially unchanged except for slow mutation. The Y-chromosome is passed down exclusively from father to son. By comparing these 2 lineages separately, researchers can reconstruct the maternal history and the paternal history of a population independently of one another, and at Chagyrskaya, those 2 histories told 2 completely different stories. The Y-chromosome data, tracing the male line, showed exactly what a small, geographically stable, isolated group would be expected to show. Limited diversity, patterns consistent with men who had lived their entire lives, generation after generation, within the same local community, fathers, sons, and grandfathers who never left. The mitochondrial data told the opposite story entirely. The maternal lineages, traced through the women, displayed a level of diversity that simply did not match the rest of the population's genetic signature. The women in this small community were genetically distinct from one another in ways the men were not. This pattern is not consistent with women who were born into the group alongside the men. It is exactly the pattern you would expect if the women had originated somewhere else entirely and were later absorbed into a community they had not grown up in. In population genetics, this phenomenon has a name: female-biased dispersal. The men stay, the women move. One individual in particular made the pattern impossible to ignore. Genetic analysis traced her maternal ancestry not to the Altai region at all, but to a population associated with the Caucasus, a region located roughly 3,000 kilometers to the west. She died in a cave in Siberia carrying a maternal lineage that originated in mountains near the Black Sea. She had been moved, or her ancestral line had been moved, across a staggering distance for a species with no wheels, no draft animals, and no roads, through terrain and climate that would have made even short journeys genuinely dangerous. Female-biased dispersal itself is not unique to Neanderthals. It appears in various human societies today, and it is well documented in chimpanzees, our closest living primate relatives, where young females routinely leave their birth community to join a neighboring one, a mechanism that reduces the risk of inbreeding by ensuring new genetic material enters the group from outside. Biologically, the strategy is logical. In most species where this occurs, though, the distances involved are relatively modest. A young female moves to an adjacent territory, joins a group that is culturally and geographically familiar, and continues her life in a world that still resembles the one she came from. The disruption is real, but bounded, survivable, part of a functioning social ecosystem. Nothing about the Chagyrskaya data suggests that kind of modest, manageable movement. With effective breeding populations estimated as low as 10 to 20 individuals, neighboring Neanderthal groups could not have been living close together. Populations that small, competing for the same scarce Ice Age resources, could not sustain themselves in tight proximity to one another. The distances separating viable Neanderthal communities were almost certainly enormous, likely stretching across hundreds of kilometers of hostile frozen terrain. The woman whose lineage traced back to the Caucasus is not a strange outlier meant to be explained away as an anomaly. She is the clearest single data point in a much larger, deeply unsettling pattern. Neanderthal women were not relocating to the next valley. They were being absorbed into communities of near-total strangers, in landscapes that would have felt completely unfamiliar, separated from whatever family and community they were born into by distances that, in that world, were effectively permanent and irreversible. Whether this movement was voluntary, arranged, or compelled by circumstance is something DNA simply cannot tell us. What it can tell us is that for Neanderthal women, displacement was not an occasional exception to normal life. It was the basic architecture of their entire social existence. And that architecture was about to collide, in the most consequential way imaginable, with the arrival of an entirely different species of human. Scientists have known for well over a decade that people living today carry Neanderthal DNA. The first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, published by Svante Pääbo and his team in 2010, confirmed something that had previously only been theorized, that modern humans outside Africa carry measurable amounts of Neanderthal ancestry, typically estimated at somewhere between roughly 1 and 2% of the genome, depending on the specific population studied. It remains one of the most significant discoveries in the history of human genetics, because it proved that our species and theirs did not simply replace one another in a clean, total substitution. At some point, twice over according to later research, the two populations met, mixed, and produced children whose descendants are alive on every non-African continent today. But the specific nature of that inherited legacy is itself deeply revealing. While segments of Neanderthal nuclear DNA persist scattered across the modern human genome, their specific mitochondrial lineages and Y-chromosome lineages did not survive at all. They were filtered out entirely over tens of thousands of years, leaving only fragments of nuclear code as evidence that the encounter ever happened. This was not a simple, symmetrical merging of two equal populations. It looks instead like a one-directional absorption, and the same female-biased dispersal pattern discovered at Chagyrskaya offers a chilling explanation for why. If Neanderthal women were already the members of their species most accustomed to leaving their birth communities and integrating into unfamiliar groups as a basic condition of survival, then they were also, by that same internal social logic, the most likely point of contact when a new and unfamiliar population, modern humans expanding out of Africa, began moving into territory Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. What form that contact actually took, whether it involved anything resembling peaceful integration, coercion, or something considerably darker, is not something ancient DNA can answer. We do not have consent forms from 54,000 years ago. What we do have is the outcome, preserved in every non-African genome on the planet. Fragments of Neanderthal genetic code were carried forward, quietly, embedded in human populations, that would go on to spread across the entire globe. while the species that contributed that code did not survive as an independent lineage. And for communities already teetering at breeding populations of 10 to 20 individuals, the loss of even a small number of reproductive age women, whether to integration with modern human groups or to any other cause, was not a minor setback. It was potentially the difference between a lineage's continuation and its complete termination. Bring all of these threads together and a single coherent picture emerges, and it is not the picture that a century of popular imagination preferred, the sweeping cinematic image of modern humans overwhelming a weaker, doomed species in dramatic, decisive conflict. It is something far quieter, and in many ways far harder to sit with emotionally. Neanderthal extinction increasingly looks less like a single catastrophic event and more like a slow, compounding demographic unraveling, one that was already well underway long before the final known Neanderthal populations disappeared from sites like Gibraltar roughly 40,000 years ago. The mathematics behind that unraveling are almost brutally simple. Small groups isolated from one another across vast, frozen, resource-scarce landscapes. Women dispersing outward, away from their birth communities, into groups of relative strangers, generation after generation. Genetic diversity hovering permanently at the edge of what population genetics considers viable for long-term survival. And then, layered on top of an already fragile system, environmental catastrophe arrived. Roughly 39,000 years ago, the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption, the largest volcanic event to strike Europe in the past 200,000 years, sent massive quantities of ash across 3 continents and triggered a volcanic winter across exactly the regions where the last significant Neanderthal populations were still holding on. That eruption did not need to kill every remaining Neanderthal directly, and it almost certainly did not. It did not need to. When an entire regional population consists of scattered pockets of 10 to 20 already genetically compromised individuals, already losing reproductive age women to dispersal and to contact with an expanding rival species, a severe environmental shock does not need to be an extinction-level event on its own. It only has to nudge an already failing system slightly further in the direction it was already heading. The loss of a handful of women from a group that small is not a tragedy a population can simply recover from across the following decades. It becomes something closer to a mathematical certainty of collapse. What is genuinely disturbing about this reconstructed history is not any single moment of dramatic violence, because the evidence increasingly suggests there may not have been one decisive violent turning point at all. It is the sheer invisibility of the process. There was no single battle, no single plague outbreak, no single fire that ended it. There was only the quiet, compounding arithmetic of too few people spread too far apart, genetically isolated to the point that the species could no longer absorb even minor additional losses. Neanderthals did not fall in some singular catastrophic moment historians could point to and explain. They simply, slowly ran out of margin for error, generation after generation, until there was no margin left at all. Picture it for a moment. Small, scattered groups spread across an increasingly frozen, increasingly hostile continent. Women who had grown up somewhere else entirely, integrated into communities made up largely of strangers, raising children in a world that was steadily growing colder, darker, and quieter with every passing generation. None of them could have known they were living through the final chapters of their species' existence. They had no census data, no genetic reports, no way to grasp the scale of the demographic trap closing slowly around them across tens of thousands of years. Ancient DNA has given modern science something genuinely extraordinary in return, something far beyond simple population estimates and dispersal statistics. It has given us fragments of individual lives. A woman whose maternal genetic lineage traces back to the Caucasus, found instead in a cave in Siberia, thousands of kilometers from wherever her ancestral line began. She was real. She, or the women in her direct maternal line before her, made that extraordinary and almost certainly harrowing journey, and she died among people who were, genetically speaking, not entirely her own. That is not merely a statistic buried in a research paper. That is a human life, or something remarkably close to one. The Neanderthal legacy did not disappear completely, even if the species itself did not survive as an independent lineage. It persists today, quite literally woven into the genomes of nearly every person of non-African descent currently alive on Earth. A meaningful part of that legacy was carried forward specifically through these women, across distances and through encounters that we will likely never be able to fully reconstruct or understand from bone and DNA alone. What ancient DNA has revealed about Neanderthal women is disturbing precisely because it is so recognizably uncomfortably human. Displacement from everything familiar, isolation dressed up as survival strategy, endurance stretched to the absolute edges of what any social structure can bear before it finally breaks. They deserved a far better telling in the history books than the caricature they were given for over a century. After 300,000 years of existence and more than 100 years of being reduced to a cartoon of brutish simplicity, science is finally, carefully, piece by fragmented piece, giving Neanderthal women their actual story back.